This video is going to be on how I find some of the biggest winning stocks in the market. Now, this is kind of a spin-off of the article I wrote a couple days ago, and it's really just me showing you how I find them using the relative strength stock screener inside the Momentum Trading Strategy app. Now, before we get into this, just kind of course, I've done my market overview. I've looked at relative strength. I kind of know where strength is before I dive into stocks, right? I talk about this all the time. I'm looking from the major indexes, down to the sectors. It's kind of a no-brainer. Like I see, NASDAQ and the equal weight over the last month, not just the month, but, multiple months is the strongest area. We have tech, not just leading across the board, but like look at performance. Like almost no other area comes close. And then I get kind of an idea on the subsectors and industry groups, kind of, what's been leading within that, right? And so we kind of already know semiconductors and, software has been doing well. And so we know this before we dive into scanning for stocks. And we also know whether we're in a conducive like a good environment to be able to trade, right? And so all of that kind of is what we're doing on the weekend when the market's closed. And all right, so we've done that before. I just wanted to reiterate that. So let's dive into how we're finding now the individual stocks. And so I talk about eliminating most of the market. So I've already done this. So you don't need to do it if you're using my tool. But if you're using another tool, whether it's TradingView, Market Surge, there's so many out there. I like to slim down the universe to stocks at least $5 in price. A minimum market cap of 100 million. Minimum 30-day average volumes at least 100,000. And I don't want to deal with OTC and penny stocks, so I only highlight the major exchanges, okay? And that's already built in here if you're using the relative strength stock scanner. And then I run a basic, leaders CANSLIM screen. And so if you've taken our course, module 4 talks about the leader characteristics and what that is. If you've read William O'Neill's How to Make Money with Stocks, you know what CANSLIM is. And so it doesn't cover all the characteristics, but it covers kind of like the broad general characteristics just to kind of slim it down even further. And so that's a stock price of $10. Quarterly EPS growth is greater than 20%. Quarterly sales is greater than 20%. It's within 15% of the 52-week high. It has a minimum of 5 institutional funds and relative strength rating of 80 or higher, right? And where, you could do that manually, but instead, since it's something I run all the time, it's under here, leaders/CANSLIM. It's a preset scan. Just click that button. It automatically highlights everything for you. You can hide those filters. Kind of shows you exactly what we just mentioned here. And then just scroll down, and here are the names. And you can sort it however you want, by 1 month RS, 1 year, MTS Score, whatever. And so look what we got here. We got 105 names out of those over 3,000. And so that gives me my solid list. I'm not going to lie, out of all the other scans and screens that I mess around with, this is what gives me, at least 80, 90% of the names that I share with everyone. So if you're wondering how I find the names, and, some of these names, a lot of them were names that I was mentioning, back in January and February. For example, AOI is now up 300% from when I mentioned it. AXTI 280% since I mentioned it. SNDK 260% since I mentioned it. Dell up 180, almost 200%. MU 170%. Light 164%. Sienna 170%. We have STRL 160%. So I have, over 15 names that are up 100% that, I mentioned, back in January, February. And it was most of those names were just running a Leaders CANSLIM basic filter here. And what do I do from here? Then I just kind of start with the top of the list. I like to have these side panels up so I can see, I kind of already know it meets the checklist, so that doesn't really matter for this one. But then I look at, are the earnings accelerating, or are they just stable across the board? Are they decelerating? That's kind of a warning for me. Same thing with sales. Are there sales to support the earnings growth? Because earnings can be big, and then you can see no growth behind it, and that's probably only going to be a shorter term moving stock. It doesn't have the fuel behind it. I look at the estimates. I like to see that the fund ownership is increasing quarter over quarter there. And so that's what I'm looking at as I kind of go through the name. I could either add additional, this is how I like to preset my scanner to look. You can customize, how you want everything up here. Sometimes I'll have ROE in here. Or you can just kind of dive into the additional fundamentals. Just hit the fundamentals. You get the big fundamental box that kind of shows everything. And I just go down the list, name by name. And as I find names that I want to add to the watch list, I'm just going to use TTM as an example. I hit the plus sign, and if it's extended, nowhere near a buy point, I just add it to the watch. If it's near a pivot, basically saying it's near a point that I can buy it, then I add it to near pivot because those names are more important to me. Actionable, I don't even know why I have that. Don't worry about that. That's kind of, obviously you've placed a trade, right? Or if you're a longer term trader, position trader, maybe you have a couple days before it leaves the buy zone. So maybe that's what's inactionable. But so then I add it to my watch list. And that's my goal here for screening and scanning. I'm just adding names to the watch list, and then I can go deeper on research. I can go deeper on kind of the other characteristics that I'm not screening for, like what new product or new service, where's it at? If I'm looking for stocks in tech that are aligned with AI and the hottest industry groups, what part is it playing, within this? For example, Light, when I found it doing a generic screen like this. And it wasn't until after kind of doing some additional research, I start seeing, why it's important in the AI theme. Eventually we end up seeing that, NVIDIA invested into them and how it kind of plays in this bigger picture of what's driving the bull market. Now that is, my first main screen I do. You can add additional quality filters, right? So out of these 105 names, maybe I want to add some stuff. So I'm going to go back to advanced filters, and I want to make sure with, it has at least 15% ROE. Or if it doesn't have 15, or I want pre-tax margins to at least be 15%. And so once that's set, I kind of go back down and look, it's slimmed down that 100 down to 57. So now I don't just have big earnings, big sales. I also have some good profitability metrics behind it. And now I can go through those names. So adding kind of, if you have other stuff that you're looking for, maybe you want to look at, ADR percent, whatever other metrics you want to look at, you can layer that on top of that basic CANSLIM screen. The next thing I like to look at, because this kind of gives me my growth stock, William O'Neill, everything he kind of teaches in his book, that's kind of covering most of it. You could also add, annual earnings are not really in this screen. So if you want to add, significant, annual earnings growth, over the last 3 years, like he talks about, you can add that. Next thing I like to look at is, I'll clear this out, EPs, or big gap ups of at least 10%. That's basically what that is. And so, there's only two names yesterday. Only two names kind of gapped up like that. Some days you'll see 10 names, some days 5. But, recently I shared Dell back February 27th, had a huge gap up day. And then since then it's run up, almost 200%. And so I found that name was on my radar because of that big gap up day. It gapped up. It kind of moved up a little bit after that gap up day, kind of paused for a few days to a week, and then ran back to new highs. And these big gap ups are important to track because a lot of the times it's catching, investors are caught off guard. Or them, they maybe there was a big earnings that, caught everyone off guard, or there's a new FDA approval for a drug, or think a new contract for an space and defense company where they got a big government contract. It usually shows, not all the time, but, it shows like, wow, everyone's kind of caught off guard, and, the institutions are kind of then piling into this name. So that's one thing I track. The next thing I run a screen for is, the biggest movers. So I do this the morning of, with live to kind of see what's gapping up and what is moving pre-market. But in this one, I'm also just looking at, what yesterday or after the market closes. This will include today's movers. And I'm just trying to see what's been moving. And sometimes you'll see some of the names that you've been tracking, like STRL, ScanDisk is on this list. And I just kind of go through those names. There'll be a lot of junk, too, that I just won't care about. Like, I don't care if it doesn't have the EPS and the earnings. But if you're a technical trader that doesn't care, obviously, about the fundamentals, and you just care about relative strength, then you're going to find a lot of good names just looking at what's been moving. The next thing is I talk about, the trend template, following the trend, layering in price above the 50-day, above the 200-day, and the 50 is above the 200-day, that basic trend template. And you can do that. And, if you're a technical trader, again, ignore the fundamentals, or you can layer this on top of the fundamentals. And so this is something I like to have layered with all my screens, basically. And then the new 52-week high list, no different than what IBD does. I want to look at, what's making new highs. Again, you're going to start seeing the same names over and over again, MU, AMD. And so, all right, before I move on, I just want to let you know, I've talked about this, and I've shared the reason why I've been sharing some screenshots of names I mentioned back in January and February that have, gone up, a few 100% since then, is because back then, I'm not trying to brag. I'm not trying to be like, look at how smart I am. It's not any of that. It's because I understand the mindset of a newer trader. And a lot of people back then were asking me, but it's extended. If the numbers are this high, it's not, how could it keep continuing? And, William O'Neill was trying to explain this in his book. And, it's something that I try to get across to people is that even when it's before its big move, or say it's had most of its big move, but even with these high relative strength numbers, high MTS score, massive earnings and sales, that it could still move hundreds of percent, 1,000% from there before it's over. Eventually, yes, it's not going to run like that forever. But for example, AAOI, when I mentioned it, and AXDI and ScanDisk and MU and Light, they all had 98, 99 relative strength, these high relative strength scores, and then they still moved hundreds of percent in just a few months from there. So don't be scared when you see all of this. This is the characteristics of growth stocks, okay? All right, so then I like to look at, and I talked about in the article, industry groups, right? And we've already kind of know from the relative strength dashboard, but, I like to look at, here, it breaks it up into 140 groups. Sometimes before I do industry groups, I look at the sectors. And this isn't the 11, official sectors, but it breaks it up into 20. And then, I can look at, so for example, I know tech's driving the market. I can click on that. Actually, let me clear this out. There's 246 names in here. I click on that. You see the 246 names in the scanner. And then I could filter, or I can add additional screens on top of this. I can screen within this sector. So, for example, within that sector alone, let's see here. Here we go. We got 47 names that are leader CANSLIM names inside electronic and technology. Let's see if we go down here. Just let's pick you got 3 within consumer durables. Or you could just look at, the sector. Let's look at the sector by itself, and you can just sort. Or you can add, your own advanced filters. Just click on filters, and you can kind of add your own filters here. Or just sort it by whatever you want to look at, like 3-month relative strength, earnings, and kind of go through the sector. And now going back to industry groups. So blended is kind of looking at kind of all the different time frames and kind of giving you an idea of just the strongest industry groups. But if you want to just look at time frame, click on by time frame, and it'll show you the rank. You click up here. Right now it's on 1 month. But say you want to look at over the last week, or you want to look over the last year. For this example, I'm going to click 3 month, just because since the new stage 2 uptrend starting in early April, we see semiconductors. And it'll show you by time frame. Like semiconductors is weakened so far over the 1 week, but 1 month, 3 month, you see how strong it's been. And you can look at it by relative strength rating too. And there you go. And so same concept is look, I tend to look at the growth categories like semiconductors, computer hardware. I'm going to skip aluminum that has 4 stocks in it. I'm going to skip this one. I'm not really interested in REITs. So, but I'll look in these. Let's go to computer hardware. I think I had another filter on. Oh no, there we go. 20 names in here. And then I want to I'm going to filter it. I'm going to sort it by the MTS score. And there you see some big names, WDC, Dell, etc. All right, so then after that, I look through industry groups. You're going to see a lot of the same names that you see on the leaders CANSLIM. I then look at the last thing I talked about was the MTS score. So if you're wondering how to do that, is I go to filters, I click show advanced filters, and I go to MTS filters. Now, I like to just keep it on the 1 year, and the default's kind of the 1 year. And I'll say it's the same thing as like relative strength, 1 to 99, 99 being the best, 1 being the worst. I think 50 kind of like middle average. So I'm going to put 95, and I get out of those 3,000 stocks, I get 82 names. And I'm going to sort it by MTS score. And here you go. Now, why do I like the MTS score? Because it's looking at all the characteristics that I like to look at, right? It's looking at relative strength. It's looking at earnings. It's looking at sales. It's looking at, the ROE and the margins. It's looking at the industry group, proximity to the 52-week high. It's looking at all these metrics, and it's rating it from best to kind of worst stock. And so, in different bull markets, we're going to see different numbers for what's good earnings, good sales. It's not always the same bull market over bull market. But what this does, this is ranking it against all other stocks. So the MTS score is always going to tell you what are the best stocks with these best characteristics. And it's kind of weighting it. It's not perfect, but it does a pretty good job. And as you can see, again, you see a lot of the big names automatically here. And so this is kind of cutting out a lot of the noise. We got 82 names to go through. Now, of course, this is just finding stocks. Like, I do want to reiterate, like, this is just screening and finding the names. You then want to go do it. You want to look at the chart. You have to put in that chart work too. You want to look for the other characteristics. For example, I found NVIDIA. I talk a lot about it in the course. We're going to go back when it was building its VCP, right? Here was, I'm going to turn off some of this stuff here. Here was NVIDIA, and we already had a huge move up. It was part of the AI, and we start getting this contraction pattern, right, where price is kind of tightening up the right side of the chart. And this is what it looks like. NVIDIA had a good high RS. It was already on my watch list. I'm still looking now at, like, price and volume, right? I'm looking at the supply and demand, the S in CANSLIM. And I'm seeing here that on the last pullback, we get higher lows. I'm seeing, you look down here, I'm seeing volume drying up, which is what I want to see. And then I already know if it breaks out here, we're going to say, 50 to $51, I want to buy. And, I get a big day like that on big volume moving in. It moves in. I buy through that point. So I'm looking at, I'm seeing volume drying up. I'm doing my research on, NVIDIA and its part it's playing in the AI kind of theme. I'm seeing, the fund ownership increasing. So there's, I'm determining the end, like what new products or new management. There's research I'm doing to give me the conviction too, besides just this screen and scan. So this kind of puts it into, where I'm noticing it, but then I am doing that extra work. And some of that extra work, there's no screen for, right? It's just old-fashioned research and reading about the company and everything. And then I've built a plan, and I kind of know, like, hey, I like this price tightening up the right side. I like what I'm seeing with volume, and I'm gonna buy, and I'm gonna set my stop. With it, it's about 6% from the buy point to the low, because if it comes back down to here, I know I'm wrong. And yeah, then you're in the move, and it's moved. Obviously, you as it got closer, maybe in here, it wasn't just in your watch status. As it was tightening up towards the highs, it was near pivot. And as you see the volume dry up, you have it near pivot, and then boom, it becomes actionable. Okay. And, you're managing that within the watch list. So I'll do kind of a separate video and talking about watch lists and all that. But all right, that kind of talks about, there's more screens and scans that I do and that you can do, but those are kind of the main ones. That's how I'm finding these big names. And again, there's 15 names that I've shared with everyone using exactly what you see here that have moved up 100+% just since January, February. And so, of course, maybe you're gonna get stopped out on some of those. Some of them you're only gonna take, maybe 40, 50%, even 25, 30% before you sell some into strength. Maybe you didn't hold it the whole time. Doesn't matter. I'm just saying this is finding the names that are working, the biggest leading names in the market. So let me know if you have any questions. I can't really think about anything else to kind of go over right now, but if you have any questions, let me know. And until next time, I wish you all the best.